I'm up here really not to provide expertise, since I have none in South Asian affairs. I guess, having said I'm in journalism, that indicates I have no expertise in anything. American journalism prides itself on being devoid of expertise. But I am interested in this subject for a couple of different reasons. One is, I'm 55 years old. I grew up, my political consciousness in the US was really formed in the context of the growth of a reactionary, right-wing religious movement, what's typically called the Christian right, which came to prominence during my adult life. At the same time, there's been an intensification of corporate power in this phenomenon we call globalization. The growth of the religious right, I think, limits us as a people. And the intensification of corporate power doesn't really meet the needs of the people. That's the landscape I have grown up in a sense. Turns out the US is not alone in these trends. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So for those of us who are born and raised in the United States, there's a real opportunity to learn about another important part of the world. There's another reason I think it's important for us to be here, even if we're not from India or don't have direct connections to India. And that's because we should always remember that what happens in the United States matters, no matter what part of the world we're talking about. That as the dominant world power, that's changing slowly, but I think still true that the United States is the dominant world power. That means that US policy matters. And how the United States deals with some of these trends in India, we're going to hear about tonight, will have a big effect on India and on the rest of the world. So all of us who live in the United States, no matter what our connections to the region we're talking about, I think should care about this. The last thing I wanted to say real briefly was that you saw the word tolerance in this title for the talk, Is India Becoming Intolerant? And I just wanted to say one thing about tolerance, that in the United States, also in my lifetime, there's been a growth of an appreciation of diversity, multiculturalism, you'll hear it, often all framed with this need to be tolerant. And I suppose I should be grateful for tolerance. After all, people have been tolerating me for many years. So the concept of tolerance is very important in my life, I suppose. But often tolerance is used as a defense against critical thinking and engagement. That if we tolerate everybody and everything in the name of diversity and multiculturalism, we often don't do the kind of critical thinking we need to do to make judgments, because tolerant or not, we are always making judgments. So I think this notion of tolerance without critique is very dangerous, and that's what we're going to try and do tonight. We're going to talk about three concepts. We're going to talk about India, which is a country, of course, about Hinduism, a religious tradition, and about Hindutva, which is, you'll hear much more about that cultural and political philosophy, and how these three things are related, or in some cases not related. And to help us work through the history and contemporary questions, we have two people I'm very excited to hear. Briefly, the sort of academic biography. To my far left is Snehal Snehal Shingavi, who is an assistant professor in the Department of English here, the author of a new book, The Mahatma Misunderstood, The Politics and Forms of Literary Nationalism in India. Snehal's a very accomplished teacher here, but I know him as much from his community and political activism and organizing in town. And I think that's a part of the work of a faculty member that's too often ignored. So it's great to have one of this campus's most active faculty member here. Next to me is Rahul Mahajan, who I met years ago, I guess, some number of years ago, when Rahul was finishing a doctoral degree in physics here. And a lot of my own political organizing in Austin and on campus started under the tutelage of Rahul. in a group we used to call the No War Collective. Rahul has since moved on to the University of Wisconsin at Madison, where he's finishing up a degree in sociology. Rahul's also written books, the most recent, Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond, and also, I think, a good model for a scholar, an academic, someone who is in the university system, but always tries to apply that learning to the larger questions of the world. So with that, I'm going to sit down and turn it over to Snehal.
So what we've done is decided to break up this presentation into two parts, and I'm really going to try to talk about some of the history of the development of the Hindu right in India, and Rahul is going to talk, I think, much more about the contemporary situation. There are, I think, 2 or 3 immediate reasons why a conversation like this is important. Probably most recently has been Penguin's decision to pull all the copies of Wendy Doniger's book, The Hindus and Alternative Histories, from its shelves and pulp all the available copies that they had of it because they were afraid of a lawsuit from a far-right Hindu organization which argued that the book, and particularly the cover of the book, which makes one wonder whether they read the book at all or not, was offensive to Hindus. Which has started now, I think, an increasing conversation inside of India about whether or not free speech and the free expression of ideas is actually tolerated, or if concerns about hurt religious sentiment mobilized opportunistically by the Hindu right will always predominate in the political discourse. The second reason I think to have a conversation like this that's important is, of course, the fact that Narendra Modi, the architect in many ways of the horrific violence that took place in Gujarat several years ago, in the aftermath of the riots, helped to really sort of clean up the city and make sure that no serious charges were placed against the police officers who were complicit in the rioting or any of the right-wing organizations, which we know played a very strong hand in the promotion of that violence in Ahmedabad. Is running for prime minister, and conversations are already afoot about whether or not Modi will be allowed to set foot in the United States if he should be elected prime minister, something that the United States has long done, largely because of activist pressure from people here, forced the hand of the government to deny Modi, it's weird, we're in the Moody College talking about Modi. Anyway, sorry. Deny Modi a visa here. And so already conversations are happening at the State Department level about whether that policy should change, which means that we have, I think, an important role to play in talking about the normalization of far-right politicians, especially international figures, and whether or not they're allowed into this country. And the third reason is that the atrocities that took place, the sort of communal violence that took place in Ahmedabad still goes to this day unresolved. There were just recently sort of judicial, whitewashings of Modi's crimes. He was given a clean sheet on the question of his involvement in Ahmedabad, to, I think, the horror of many, many activists inside of India. So those are just the 3 immediate reasons for thinking about a question like this. And I think that in terms of our engagement with it, we should be mindful of trying to understand exactly what is taking place in India and, of course, United States foreign policy relations with that country. Now, the last thing that I want to say about this, and this is where kind of current geopolitics are very important. The United States has long held to a strategy of regional control in the Middle East and South Asia, which relied on a kind of trinity of foreign policy interests between the United States, Israel, and India, in which joint military exercises and exchanges of intelligence were going to be the way that the United States conducted its war against terrorism. This, of course, was a contradictory strategy because they also relied heavily on Pakistan being a frontline state against Afghanistan to help in the war on terror. But the ideal trinity was supposed to be India, Israel, and the United States, all of which were mobilizing domestic kinds of Islamophobia at the same time as they were marshaling, their own imperial visions for the reorganization of South and Southwest Asia. So that's by way of trying to situate this conversation. I'll tell you a little bit about myself biographically, which I think may also bear on this. As a kid growing up in Houston, Texas, my father would often take me to Saturday VHP shakas. The VHP is the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, or the sort of cultural wing of what's called, the Sangh Parivar, the family of organizations which comprise the Hindu right. The Vishwa Hindu Parishad, the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, or the National Volunteer Corps, and the Bharatiya Janata Party, or the Bharati always gets translated as Indian, but it's really not Indian. It means something more like Hinduized, or I don't know how to translate Bharatiya adequately. There's not really a good English word for it. But the Indian People's Party is the way that it normally gets sort of translated. So as a kid, I went to VHP shakas for quite some time. I met a number of the leading members of the RSS who are expatriates. Houston happens to be a hub for a lot of expatriate RSS and VHP activity. And so I have a kind of family knowledge of some of these folks and some of their ideas and some of the organizing that they do. I've had dinner at most of their houses, for instance, and met people like L.K. Advani, and or at least was participating in a lot of the conversations, especially in the late 80s and early 90s, about the right-wing movements and as they were growing in India at the time. Now I say that to explain that this is not simply a set of political ideas that some people over in India practice, but they're actually well financed and funded by friends and family here in the United States who do quite a bit of organizing for the RSS and VHP. They fund their coffers. My dad and his friends actually just went back to India to campaign for Narendra Modi in the hopes that they could help him get elected to prime minister. And so I mean, you can imagine what our dinner conversations are like, my father and I. But there are sort of deep roots that connect the expatriate community to the religious right. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well in this presentation. But before we do a long version of the history, I want to put three things out there at the forefront in terms of the way that we might frame a conversation about Hindutva, the religious right, and religious conflict in South Asia. Because I think there's a common sense way that often this stuff gets articulated that is not terribly helpful in disarticulating exactly the various processes that are happening in South Asia. The first and most important thing is that while the language that this conflict articulates itself in is religious, this is not a religious conflict. It has very little to do with religion, other than the fact that it becomes the grammar in which people express. This really is a social conflict with deep social roots, and it's important to understand it, because otherwise you're left with the impression that for thousands of years there's been some sort of congenital hatred between Hindus and Muslims because of the debates over one god or 1,000 gods, or books based in the text or not based in the text. And it really has very little to do with the content of the religion, and very much more to do with sort of the ways that religious identities have been mobilized in a modern way. The second thing to understand is that the communal violence and the rise of the Hindu right is not a spontaneous phenomenon. It's actually a well-orchestrated, highly organized, very disciplined movement with a cadre of people who have a conscious plan. And the sort of ascription of the violence to mindless mobs roaming the streets as if they're somehow religious sensitivities are just so precarious that anything will set people off completely does a disservice to an understanding of the reality on the ground, which is a very, very well orchestrated, well thought out, and very organized plan that's put into place. And the third thing to remember, I think, too, in trying to talk about this is that Hindutva is not simply the kind of spectacular violence, although that's, I think, normally what we associate with communalism are the riots that took place after the demolition of the Babri Masjid in Ayodhya in 1991, or the massacre in Ahmedabad in 2002. It's not simply the massacres. There's also a low-grade, everyday kind of chauvinism against Muslims that allows the more spectacular kinds of violence to happen. And it's important to put all those things, I think, in a kind of context. But if you only take one thing away from what I'm going to say today, I want you to take this away, that Hinduism is a invented phenomenon. It is claims to have deep traditional roots, but if you were to ask Hindus or people that you would think of as of Hindus 1,000 years ago, how they would describe the religion, it would be very, very different from the way that modern people understand Hinduism, what they think of as its central tenets, what they think of as its belief system. It would have been a very, very different phenomenon. That in fact, Hinduism, as we understand it today, is a modern phenomenon that was developed primarily through the intervention of middle class and upper caste Indians and British colonial agents who were attempting to figure out what it was that they were conquering when they came to India to conquer it. And the identity of Hinduism really emerges as a modern identity in the colonial period. There's a fantastic book by Nicholas Dirks about the sort of invention of the Hindu identity, the kinds of processes of British colonial intervention that went into creating the identity. But a number of things did not happen before the British that I think are probably important to know. Not every Hindu thought that the Gita was a central text in Hinduism. There was quite a bit of debate about this. Not every Hindu believed the Vedas were central texts in Hinduism. In fact, most Hindus did not believe that their religions were textual religions before British intervention. It would be more common to think of Hinduism as, very local temple ritualistic practices that had, separately developed over time and millennia. But one of the things that the British do is try to figure out what this thing called Hinduism is. And the way that they do that is by trying to understand it as a set of religious beliefs grounded in textual study, which, by the way, the Brahmins had a monopoly on reading and understanding. And so the version of Hinduism that we inherit in the 19th and 20th centuries really do come from this kind of combination of British anthropological and census observations of what is taking place in India to try to understand the people as having a belief system that's understandable and definable. And it's connected to a sort of newly emergent identity of Hindus, which are trying to now advocate for rights from a colonial government. These two things work in tandem. Now, the British and European understanding of Hinduism wasn't always entirely negative. Some of it was because, the British were very interested in trying to reform certain practices which they found to be, barbaric or what have you. And that became the alibi in many ways for colonialism. Sati, importantly, or the practice of widow burning, was one of the things that the British liked to talk a lot about as a practice that was sort of seen as a reason why the British had to be in India to save, brown women from brown men who were going to burn them, not dissimilar all that much from the alibi that is used to invade Afghanistan and Iraq. But the sort of logic of British colonial intervention was not simply to see Hinduism as a bad thing that could be reformed by evangelizing Christianity in India. There's also a strain of European thought which thought that Hinduism was a fantastic tradition, right? This is usually understood as German romantic views of India, and you think even about the ways that Rabindranath Tagore's poetry was received globally. There was a sense that there was something spiritual, mystical, deep about India that Europe thought that it was getting access to when it came, and that people attempted to lionize and spread and proselytize about in very many ways in Europe as an opposition to some of the horrors of industrial capitalism in Europe. So you had two traditions coming in simultaneously in the 19th century, one which thought of Hinduism as a barbaric practice that needed to be eradicated, and another which saw Hinduism as a kind of glorious traditional past that needed to be resurrected. The right-wing Hindu tradition really does come at the kind of nexus of these two ideas of what is happening in British colonial thought. It's an attempt to figure out what this Hindu identity is, if such a thing exists. The British seem to call us all Hindus, so now we must try to figure out what this identity is. And if the logic went, we have been colonized by the British, we need to figure out what went wrong in Hinduism or in India so that we can also gain our freedom or modernize the religion in some ways. So at the turn of the 19th century, you have the beginnings of Hindu revivalist movements all throughout India, trying to figure out ways of modernizing the religion, some of them to do away with practices which are seen as outmoded, some barbaric, discriminatory, etc. Most importantly amongst these, of course, are the Brahmo Samaj in Calcutta and the Arya Samaj in Punjab, which try to bring the religion out of sort of what people think of as a kind of superstitious or maybe ritualistic practices and into a sort of modern sensibility. Both of those revivalist traditions have then at their heart the textualization of Hinduism. So now an understanding of Hinduism as a religion of the book, which it had not been before. And a religion of the book is important because the Abrahamic traditions were understood in India as Judeo-Christian, Muslim traditions, all seen as religions of the book, whereas Hinduism was seen as a religion without a book. And so a book now becomes very, very important to have, and the Gita and the Vedas and the Upanishads are resurrected now to prove that India has a deep sort of textual tradition. Alongside these sorts of revival movements, which are trying not only to modernize the religion, they're also now competing for the first time for political power on the basis of separate identities. The British decide that there are really two sets of people who live in India. One set they call Hindu, the other set they call Muslims. There also happen to be some Christians and Sikhs, but they're not terribly over-concerned about those groups. But in order to understand the development of something like religious rivalry, you have to remember that seats now are apportioned in municipal elections and local elections on the basis of religious identity, on the basis of religious division of seats. And so now political contests under British rule are done on the basis of religious identities. So many seats for Hindus, so many seats for Muslims. And this gives really local religious leaders an enormous role that they can then play in mobilizing democratic support for various officials and what have you. Now, the Indian National Congress, which is born in 1885, tries very hard to be a big umbrella organization representing both Hindus and Muslims. But even from the very beginning, the Congress Party had a kind of soft Hindutva or soft Hindu position. Gandhi sort of is the most famous example of this because on the one hand was a man who reached out to and saw the value of organizing a broad fight against British colonialism by including Sikhs, Muslims, Christians, Hindus in the same tent. But the vocabulary that Gandhi used was almost always a Hindu vocabulary. It was deeply grounded in the Gita. He thought of himself as a Sanatani, meaning a traditional Hindu thinker, and mobilized these sorts of soft Hindu politics all the time. But the biggest problem that happens under British colonialism, which gives rise to what we now think of as modern Hindutva, is the inability to solve the problem that the British create. When they displaced the Mughals, they set up different kinds of infrastructure all throughout the countryside. And at the time, India is roughly 80 to 85% an agrarian society. The biggest change that they make is the transformation of land rights and taxation rights all throughout India. In places where they have majority Muslim cultivators of the land, they decide to put Hindus as tax collectors and large landlords. In the places where they have majority Hindu cultivators of the land, they put Muslim tax collectors and landlords. And this sets up an immediate class conflict in a number of places between Hindus and Muslims, which has nothing to do with religion, but has everything to do with exploitation, has everything to do with the way that colonial governance was set up. The inability of the Congress Party to resolve that economic tension between landlords and peasants meant that in every situation where there were problems with rent, there were problems with starvation and hunger, or there were problems with just exploitation on the land, right-wing Hindu organizations had a much easier time explaining to people that the cause of this was a religious conflict rather than an economic conflict. And the Congress Party was then seen as the party which stamped down on poor Muslim peasants trying to advocate for their land and their rights, or poor Hindus advocating for their land and their rights. And that became the way that right-wing Hindu and right-wing Muslim groups grew in this period. There are several Bengalis in the room, so I'm guessing some of you have read The Home in the World by Rabindranath Tagore. It's a really great novel, but it's about this problem. It's about what do you do when you're a Hindu landlord with a lot of Muslim tenants who are being exploited by other Hindu landlords. What is your relationship then to the nation? It's a brilliantly good novel. If you have a chance to read it, highly recommend it. That brings us to 1947 and the moment of India's independence. And here then, of course, is the most famous act of Hindu aggression and chauvinism, which is the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi by Nathuram Godse, a member of a far-right organization connected to or becomes, sort of the predecessor for the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. Godse famously says that the reason that Gandhi has to die and has to be assassinated is because he allows for the partition of India to take place. The partition of India too is important in the sense that the huge displacement of Hindus and Muslims through the creation of what was a Muslim state in Pakistan and a theoretically secular but largely Hindu state set off waves and waves of violence all throughout the country that could not be solved very easily, especially given the kinds of politics that have been mobilized to get independence at the time. If we go from the moment of independence to the current period, there are really three distinct phases over which the right wing has evolved, and we should talk about sort of the changing nature of the Hindu right and the way that it's become mainstreamed and modernized as well throughout this period. Between 1947 to 1975, the Hindu right is a largely marginal force in Indian politics and society. That's largely because of the prestige and dominance of the Indian National Congress Party, the belief in the idea that what India is going to be is a secular, socialist, in Nehru's terms, a society which is meant for the uplift of everybody. You have huge participations of people in rural uplift schemes and in social programs and social welfare and social project works that the government is trying to set up. And the idea, too, that since they were responsible for the assassination of Gandhi, they ought to be marginalized. And from the period of 1947 to 75, really, there's a kind of official understanding that the Hindu right is going to be marginalized, criminalized. They can't run for political office if you've held membership in the RSS during this period. And it changes the way that the Hindu right operates. Importantly, their evacuation from the political sphere meant that they then entered into the cultural and religious sphere. And it's been on the basis of those two things that they really grow between 1947 and 1991. That means organizing through temple committees, organizing to do charitable work, organizing to do educational programs, and to build universities and schools. Those become the primary way that they grow a base of supporters. Now, in this respect, the Hindutva far right is very, very similar to far right religious organizations that we've seen in the Arab and Muslim world, that we see in the Deep South in the United States. It fills a vacuum in some ways created by extreme poverty and the lack of a good social safety network that might exist. The church and the temples become the primary way for people then to receive social services. But Hinduism becomes important in this period too in another way, which is that India, when it's created in 47, is really an incoherent nation. And that may seem like a provocative thing to say, but you think about it, it's more than 25 different languages. It's people who don't really have a network or an infrastructure which connects them together. They don't all go to the same schools or get the same kind of curriculum. And the one thing that is then relied on over and over again to secure the identity of the nation is its kind of Hindu identity, a kind of celebration of its Hindu architecture, Hindu religious icons. There's a whole genre of Bollywood films that emerge in the 50s and 60s called the theological or the mythological, which was really this kind of iconization of Hindu gods as part of the national imaginary. They try to do a couple of Quranic ones, but they fail miserably in the 50s. It really is a sort of Hindu mythology which is going to cement the religious identity. Between 1975 and 1991, you have a different phase of Hindutva. 1975 is Indira Gandhi's emergency, and she basically implements a kind of military martial rule in India and imprisons her opposition, which at the time includes people who are part of the Hindu right. This is the moment, by the way, at which L.K. Advani and what is his name? Vajpayee becomes a sort of national hero in his opposition to Indira Gandhi's martial rule and her crackdown on civil liberties. Now, I don't know how much of the Indian history you know, but the emergency happens largely because of an election that Indira Gandhi rigged and got caught, and was very clear that the election had been rigged. She was in fear of losing to her political opposition, but India was also at the time going through an economic stagnation, and two forces joined together to challenge Indira Gandhi. The far left, the communists, the socialists, etc., and the far right sort of joined together in what was called the Janata Party to challenge her. Jayaprakash Narayan leads the Janata Party in a really sort of incredible campaign, calling for never-ending revolution against what Indira Gandhi was doing, but the kind of collaboration between the left and the right raises the Hindu right now to having a sort of official mainstream status, and they're seen as a politically viable and legitimate group for the first time in independent India through the experience of the Indian emergency. But the period from 75 to 91, after the emergency is really where they take off in a major way. You have the spread now of the cadre organizations of the RSS and the VHP all over the country in a major way. Funding networks the United States began after Indian professionals come to the US and start sending money back home, and the real growth of a kind of Hindu nationalist organizational network all throughout India, which is trying to figure out a way to become a kind of mainstream party. And their primary solution that they invent in 1975 through 1991 is to make an issue out of minority rights in India. Three things happen at the same time that are important in our context. The first is the release of the Mundell Commission report, which indicates that after 30 or 40 years of independence, India has not been able to do well by its low caste citizens, and that affirmative action, what is called the policy of reservations in India, must be implemented, which is seen as a direct affront to privileges held by the high castes, and the BJP mobilizes the sentiment in pretty dramatic ways and organizes it in opposition to the policy of reservations. The second thing that happens is a controversy over the mosque in Ayodhya, the Babri Masjid, and whether or not it's a legitimate mosque or the birthplace of the Hindu Lord Ram and should be razed to the ground and a new temple built in its place. And the third thing, of course, is an attempt to liberalize the economy in a major way. In 1991, all three of those things sort of come together, and it becomes the cause around which the BJP goes from a marginal group that has some constituencies to being a national force to becoming now the national party. The BJP has always had a very tense relationship with its far-right cousins. It tended to be a party which focused primarily on the economic questions and really was the party of big business in this period of trying to get out of the much more regulated capitalism that the Congress Party provided. But it was happy to use in 1991 all of the sort of political networks built up by the RSS and the VHP and other Hindu organizations in order to grow. And what we're really seeing now is the consequence of a very opportunistic style of politics based around mobilizing a Hindu identity for very right-wing political ends coming to fruition. The present moment, I think, is important to say that part of the reason why Hindutva has an audience now is not because of economic desperation, although there is quite a bit of economic desperation in India. The real reason why Hindutva seems to be growing now is because everybody wants to believe that India is doing really, really well economically. This kind of story about India shining and the rise of a new superpower and the coming onto the global stage is a story that the media has been pumping for the last 10 years nonstop into Indian homes. Nobody can understand why poverty is so persistent, why 80% of the population lives on less than $2 a day. And the most convenient explanation that the BJP has been able to marshal is that there's corruption in the Congress Party, which is true. There's also corruption in the BJP, but we'll get to that in a second. Corruption in the Congress Party and minorities stealing privileges and opportunities that should primarily belong to Hindus in the country. And that argument is spreading like wildfire. One index of that is actually, perversely, the success of the Aam Aadmi Party and Arvind Kejriwal's organization in Delhi, which is really going off of the corruption scheme of politics, but really has no other economic program to offer in place of clean government. This has been the wave that the BJP is really riding. They're using Narendra Modi's credentials as the Mussolini of Gujarat, the guy who makes the trains run on times and build the roads, etc., as a kind of model that they want to export to the rest of the country. And it's proving to be, I think, a pretty dangerous combination of political forces. Now, whether or not in this immediate moment Hindutva is on the rise or not, I don't know. But I do know that what has happened over the course of the last 50 years is the mainstreaming of right-wing Hindu politics, such that a guy 10 years ago who was controversially understood as the butcher of Gujarat and the butcher of Ahmedabad for his responsibility and culpability of what happened there is now running for prime minister, and people are bending over backwards judicially, media, and elsewhere to sort of whitewash his record and his complicity in what is happening. And that, I think, bespeaks a really sort of dangerous moment in Indian history. It also, because my father will undoubtedly hear this, and I'll have to atone for speaking out about the BJP with him in some official way. I'll say this also for the record. The Congress Party has its hands just as dirty, not only in corruption schemes, but also in mobilizing of violence against minorities. When Indira Gandhi was assassinated, her son had no problem unleashing, mobs against Sikhs all over the country, and the kind of opportunistic mobilization of violence against minorities by the two major parties is a long tradition in India, and it is not as though one represents, a kind of clean government about ethnicity and the other one is simply the murderous one. They've both participated in nasty ways in this kind of stuff. The one thing that should, I think, give us all hope is that there are now a generation of people who have been trained after watching what happened in Ayodhya and watching what happened in Gujarat in, I think, really, really good anti-communalist politics, doing very, very fantastic grassroots work to try to stop this kind of hate from spreading all over India. But it really is a challenge because of just how well organized the Hindu right actually is. And as long as there's going to be massive amounts of economic and political inequality in India, the Hindu right is going to have an audience because they provide a very easy explanation to understand why India is doing as badly as it's doing. And that's, I think, the other problem, which is the problem of India's development, which I think a real solution to communalism is going to need to involve some explanation of what happened to development in India. So.
It's kind of been amusing me the past half an hour or so that Snehal and I are here talking to a bunch of real Indians about India. And unlike Snehal, I'm not an expert on India and I don't study it regularly. So I'm going to talk about a number of things. I hope I can weave them together convincingly. I'll start and end with India. Let me start by saying, I guess this will be a little bit repetitive of what Snehal has said, but I want to sort of situate it. Let us think for a minute about the situation that is being faced in India with regard to the BJP and the Sangh Parivar, and think about how to characterize it. So first of all, we have the latest polls tell us the BJP is headed for a very substantial victory in the next parliamentary elections. Not enough to form a government all on its own, but then it's been a long time since any party's been able to do that in India. But a very substantial victory coupled with a large defeat for Congress. Who knows if that's actually the case, but it seems most likely to be the case. And so we face the prospect of someone who is systematically complicit in crimes against humanity being the Prime Minister of India. To put this in perspective for Americans, imagine it's as if, say, George W. Bush and Dick Cheney were in charge of the United States. That, although, that's half facetious, because the difference, of course, is that the crimes against humanity that Modi and a large number of others are complicit in happened within their own territory, and somehow people feel that makes things morally very different, and certainly makes things politically very different. So the first question you might ask is, well, what's really new, right? So although there's a long history of intercommunal cooperation and solidarity, there's also a long history of intercommunal violence in India. And if you look at the birth of India, first you have the partition riots, and those are particularly horrific. Nobody really knows how many people were killed. It's safe to estimate 500,000. In the subsequent decades, there have been numerous flare-ups of communal rioting. So Gujarat is one of the flashpoints. So in the late 60s, 1969, for example, there was intercommunal rioting that killed 1,000 to 2,000 people in Gujarat. As is generally the case, the significant majority of the dead were Muslim. You probably all know about the Bombay riots after the destruction of the Babri Masjid in 1992, in which about 1,000 people, again, at least 2/3 of them Muslim, were killed. So in this sense, there is, what's different? What's different about Godhra? What's different about the situation today? In another sense, you have had throughout almost the entire history of independent India, you have had an organized, call it what you will, Hindu nationalist front, the Jan Sangh, the Bharatiya Janata Party, etc., allied with a whole bunch of organizations, the RSS, the Hindu Mahasabha, the VHP, and so on. And there has always been this fundamental tension within the Sangh Parivar, or however you want to describe them at different times, between the hardcore ideological fanatics who want to push extremely agitational politics, who want to invoke constantly threat, especially the threat supposedly posed by Muslims, and who regularly want to sort of inspire violence. And you've had those who looked towards elections and wanted to, usually the general idea is that the need to win in elections causes you to sort of want to pander broadly to different constituencies, not to be too focused on some group which may not provide you enough votes to make sure you don't be too offensive and so on. And there has been this tension within the Sangh since the early 1950s at the very least. One difference, however, is that in the early decades, where probably in that tension, I mean, it's hard to say exactly, but most likely the hardcore ideological groups like the RSS and so on mostly had the upper hand in that kind of debate. But their upper hand within the Sangh Parivar meant that they were actually tremendously unsuccessful politically. There were, of course, many other factors like the dominance of Congress after independence, but for the most part, until the 1980s, the Hindu right, if you will, was not very successful. What's changed is that now you still have, at least, for the most part, on average, a dominance of the agitational element. You have the institutionalization of agitation and of invocation of communal threat since the early 1980s by the Hindu right. It's become something that is, even when there isn't explicit violence going on, it's always there in the background. There's a large group of people who are constantly exposed to propaganda about this threat, about the so-called unfair privileges that Muslims have, and so on. More recently, it's even spread. Probably most of you are aware of the anti-Christian violence also perpetrated by the Bajrang Dal, for example, in South India. This time, however, even though there is still this extreme ideological element that is often driving the agenda, they have actually managed to institutionalize power at the state and, to a degree, the national level. Yes, they've been out of power in the central government for some time, but they are a major player that's there to stay on the national level. Everybody knows that. They're not going away. In places like Gujarat, of course, they've exercised real electoral and administrative dominance. So that's one change. That's a striking change. You have an organization that is openly committed to fostering an atmosphere of tension and hatred that routinely actually lets that atmosphere, or sometimes makes that atmosphere, devolve into widespread outbreaks of violence. And it is, for the most part, even those who aren't particularly interested in fostering communal violence, give them a pass on that or essentially turn a blind eye, and still very often will turn out to support them, not just in elections, but also between elections with fundraising and so on. So that's a major change in India. The actual carnage in Gujarat in 2002, I just want to say one or two things about it, just to give you a sense of what makes it different from, say, riots that you might have even, say, in the United States, or from isolated incidents of some mob deciding that it wants to hack apart a few people. What happened in Gujarat after the incident in Godhra with the train, where about 60 mostly sort of Hindu extremist activists were burned alive. And the question of whether this was an accident or actually they were burned because of the fight they were having with the Muslim population around is still unsettled, although it quite likely was an accident. But anyway, in the aftermath of that, you saw throughout Gujarat, you saw huge mobs, thousands of people at a time. In fact, many witnesses actually claim mobs of 20 to 25,000 people gathering and making assaults on Muslim residential areas. To take one example, perhaps the one of the more high-profile ones, the residential complex of former MP Ihsan Jaffrey, who had actually run against Modi and was sort of a particular personal enemy of Modi, was attacked by a mob of thousands of people. The attack took 7 hours. During that time, Jaffrey himself called virtually everybody of importance in the entire country and said there's a mob here that's planning to kill us. By the end of it, he and about 60-odd other people were killed. This was just one of many incidents, but it's particularly striking because here was a member of, at least formerly, of the political elite. There was plenty of warning. Modi himself was well aware of the attack as it was going on, as far as we know. Again, one of the problems in actually figuring out all of the details of this is that the investigations, the primary governmental investigation was done by a committee that was appointed by Modi. The investigations were done in a context where witnesses were subject to very large amounts of coercion. We will never know fully the true story, but on balance, it looks like, in fact, there was certainly systematic complicity right up to the top level in Gujarat with the massacres, and it's quite like there was certainly evidence of pre-planning in terms of sort of infrastructure preparation and organization, although how much there is of that is unclear. Anyway, it's quite a remarkable thing that a politician is this deeply involved in a series of massacres that probably claimed somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 lives. And then later in 2002, essentially campaigns on the basis of the massacre, in the sense that he starts what he calls a Gaurav Yatra, a procession of pride, which is, the pride is that Hindus are not going to lie down and take it anymore. When their martyrs were, burned alive in the train, they went and they did what was necessary in order to avenge that, and they weren't going to allow any more onslaughts on Hindus from all these malignant minorities. And by the way, in all of this, the invocation of 9/11 was also quite frequent. So it has it's had its political consequences in India as well as in the United States. So at the time that it happened, I think that a lot of progressive activists who were trying to understand what was going on and what was the threat in India termed it a genocide. And you can certainly make a case that it's consistent with the definition of genocide. In the aftermath, it's now 12 years since those massacres. It's pretty clear that it was not part of some sort of systematic plan to exterminate Muslims, but it did have a number of consequences that are, I think, part of a systematic plan. One of them is increased residential segregation, increased sort of separation between the different communities, which makes it particularly easy to whip up fear when you don't know anything about the other. When a lot of Hindus today don't know anything about Muslims, don't have any real interaction with them, and are willing to believe just about anything about them. So you have this particular act is, I won't say it's unique in post-independence history, but it's the most extreme. These are the worst sort of intercommunal carnage since independence. It's at a time of the most institutionalization of a political organization or complex of organizations that's dedicated to the fostering not just of division, but of actually of sporadic violence against minority communities. So it shouldn't be oversold. There is, as I said, this real tension between this kind of agitational politics and elections, and Modi himself, although he campaigned on the basis of more or less being a Muslim killer in 2002, by 2004, 5, 6, he was actually pivoting and talking about his great economic plans and pretending that he didn't know words like Godhra or massacre. So, in fact, he pivoted so far that many of the ideologues who supported him, in the RSS, for example, actually disowned Modi politically. So there is that dynamic that's going on. And so it makes it particularly difficult in a way for us to try to think about how do you address these problems? How do you address, in particular, the emerging problem of what I call, or I'm sure there are others who call it as well, neoliberal authoritarian populism? So you have groupings in numerous countries, political groupings, where they win elections, they espouse highly authoritarian ideologies, and they often push political programs that are very non-liberal in the sense of respect for basic individual rights and so on. Most of them are neoliberal in the sense, at least, that they don't do anything seriously to challenge what has been the reigning economic orthodoxy for about 20 years, and sometimes they actively promote it further. But they are very often elected. I mean, Putin is very popular in Russia. Putin wins elections. Yes, he rigs them, but he would likely win elections even if he didn't rig them. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who's now taken over as the new pharaoh in Egypt, recently his new constitution passed with a 98% vote. Now that's, of course, getting beyond the realm of democracy into Saddam Hussein territory, but it's quite likely that the count is actually accurate in a sense. You've got this problem emerging in a way in the United States as well, right? I mean, a great deal of what the Republican Party talks about today, especially at the state level, very much fits in the same mold of sort of bizarre new authoritarian impositions. And probably some of you at least have followed, for example, the spate of new legislation that would essentially make it, create a situation of something like Jim Crow for gays in Arizona, Kansas, Idaho is coming up. And again, if these things pass, they will be passed by democratically elected representatives. In numerous countries in Africa, again, you also have the same sort of rise of a particularly politicized authoritarian democracy that again often very much sort of targets homosexuals. How do you deal with this as many of you live here permanently. Some of you probably aren't permanent residents now, but will become so in the future. And so you'll be faced with the question of what do you do about politics in a faraway country when you're living in the United States. It's not a good idea to say, well, I'm far away. It's far away, so let me just concentrate on doing things in the United States, because as Snehal will tell you, there are plenty of Indians here who are very active in supporting right-wing politics in India, the politics of hatred of Hindu fundamentalism. And if there's nobody on the other side, that imbalance isn't a very good thing. So how do you actually do it? So there have been some attempts by activists here, and Snehal mentioned in 2005 getting Congress to actually not allow Narendra Modi to have a visa. Now, if Modi becomes the prime minister, the United States is not going to stop him from coming to the country. You can be sure about that. But there are things that one can try to do through lobbying Congress. Now, I want to sort of it's been a long time since I've been in the business of coming up with solutions for activists, for what people should really do. It's easier for me to come up with things that they shouldn't do. And in that regard, I do want to talk a little bit about what happens when you try to push Congress to do something about human rights in other countries. So first of all, it's a general principle that it's a lot easier to get the U.S. Congress or anybody else to stop giving something, for example, stop giving aid, stop doing something that doesn't really affect them particularly, than it is to get them to incorporate some large new positive program. So if you said, we want the United States to create a large, well-funded program that spreads religious tolerance throughout the world, that's not going to happen. Or at least that's going to be remarkably difficult to do unless you are actually serving the interests of some power grouping in the United States. On the other hand, for individual activist groups like, for example, the East Timor Action Network, to get the U.S. Congress to cut down, restrict, or even eliminate military funding to Indonesia because of the occupation of East Timor, that was something that was possible. That is something that on which they had tremendous success in lobbying Congress in the 1990s. One of the ways you do that is to talk about, well, why are we wasting all this money on other countries? Ever since the 1970s, in order to get this kind of program passed, you've basically had to have an alliance between sort of left liberals who are interested in human rights and more or less right-wing nativists or xenophobes. And believe me, there are many of the latter in Congress. There always have been, but there are even more now. So the way that people do this, and if you're going to engage in pragmatic politics, it's not clear you have a lot of choices, is to create some sort of coalition between those groups, between, say, progressive Democrats and old-style right-wing Republicans, for example, that stresses things like fiscal responsibility as well as human rights. That can work, and it has sometimes worked. And in particular, with the question of the Modi visa, the thing that people invoked was religious freedom. So I just want to caution that the invocation of religious freedom these days is a very dangerous and loaded thing to do, because there's no clear dividing line. When a religion starts, or representatives of a religion, self-appointed or otherwise, start sort of aggressively proclaiming, more and more as part of their domain. If you say that my religion precludes selling a Snickers bar to a gay person, so if I own a store, I don't have to sell a Snickers bar to them when they walk in, and you defend that on the basis of religious freedom, well, that is the way that the world is going right now. All right, so you have in Egypt, for example, again, the new constitution, which is actually a step back from the Islamist constitution of 2012, asserts a sort of traditional Islamic notion of religion, which recognizes Jews and Christians but doesn't recognize other religions. So in fact, there are no specific protections for members of other religions. You have in India, you have Hindu right-wingers aggressively proclaiming that sort of the basic standards and norms of what some of us might think of as civilization are an affront to Hindu religious freedom. You have it more and more happening here in the United States, right, where Christian notions of religious freedom are threatened in some places to completely wash over and destroy the religious freedom of others. This is the kind of complex of ideas that you deal with if you try to do something serious through, for example, the U.S. Congress, which is about the only branch of the U.S. government that is easily accessible by activists. So that's a general warning. The phrase religious freedom means very different things to different people, and I wouldn't engage with it uncritically. It's a cure that can be very much worse than the disease. And I think I've gone on a long time, so let me just come briefly back to the question of India and the sort of approach that I would like to see happen. I don't really suggest that this is necessarily a politically viable approach, and it gets back to, I think, what Snehal ended with too, which is at the same time as India has seen this institutionalization of Hindu rightism at the state and national level as part of a permanent part of the politics, with not just an electoral but a component of street violence. It's also seen tremendous economic growth that has somehow not trickled down at all. It's quite remarkable. Anyone here read Amartya Sen's new book, An Uncertain Glory? That is, I think everybody should read that. That is, it ought to be a tremendously important book, and if the sort of Indian elite opinion were not so hopelessly sort of sclerotic and narrow-minded now. His book would be what Michael Harrington's book, The Other America, was in the United States in 1962. Harrington's book disclosed to a lot of Americans who were pretty much unaware of it just what was the extent of poverty in America. And because he picked the right political moment to do it, it actually got, major governmental programs were instituted, a war on poverty, which, despite all of the retrenchment that has come later, one of the things that is permanently different because largely, initially at least because of Harrington's book, is the fact that there are nowhere near as many senior citizens who live in poverty now as there were then, and there probably won't be no matter what future assaults we see on the welfare state here. In India, however, the fact that one of the things that Sen does that's most compelling is compare India with other countries in South Asia. So remarkably, India has gone way ahead of most of them in terms of economic growth and overall wealth. So right now, India is about 3 times as well off as Bangladesh, for example, per capita. At the same time, every one of these other countries has done better on improving indicators of basic quality of life, education, basic education, childhood immunization. To pick an indelicate topic, over half of Indian households still have to defecate. The members have to defecate in the open. In Bangladesh, it's under 10%. So a country that is dramatically poorer, dramatically more crowded than India, and also dramatically more vulnerable to the ongoing consequences of climate change, has done far more to improve on just about every. It's not just a sort of an example where I could pick one index, pick childhood immunization, infant mortality, anything you like. And India has fallen behind these other countries even as it is going ahead tremendously economically. There's no political party in India anymore that is very much standing for a different way of doing things. And I want to be clear that I'm not talking about a way of doing things that is anti-capitalist or even anti-neoliberal. I mean, what we're seeing in the rest of the world is we see Thailand has universal health care. Brazil has universal health care. A country that used to be a byword for inequality has almost eliminated official poverty during the reign of Lula as president. China, which had dismantled some of its social safety net back in the 1980s, instituted a universal health care program in 2009, and even that bastion of let the individuals fend for themselves that is the United States has passed, well, I wouldn't call it universal health care, but something vaguely like it. So it's not as if this is something that necessarily even contradicts the dominant logic of neoliberalism or of the way things are going. It's simply a matter of a change in priorities. And even that is something that India is simply, there's no debate about it. There's no talk about it. This whole complex of issues could be all, about happening to people on Mars for all that they actually enter into the Indian political debate. There are a few exceptions. The Congress Alliance, the UPA, has instituted a few of the kinds of social programs that would ameliorate the worst poverty in the past 5 to 10 years. But as of now, India's record on this, the socialist country that it was supposed to be, is far worse than almost any other country you can name outside of sub-Saharan Africa or Afghanistan or extremely war-torn areas like that. There is no political agenda with regard to this right now, and it seems to me that a fundamental part of combating the rise of the Hindu right is offering an electoral alternative that is actually an alternative, that actually means something. India is a country where the poor vote more than the rich. It's not as if it's impossible to do this, but to date, nobody is doing it. Thanks.
The question is about whether there is a more general intolerance in India, that the laws are used by both the by Hindus and Muslims, and I assume other groups as well, to their own advantage. And so is it fair to call this a problem of Hindutva, or is it a more generalized problem of the use of the laws for this purpose? Now, I'm somebody who's about to test this theory. I'm publishing a translation of short stories by Muslim writers that was banned in the 1930s because The Shia and Sunni groups in Lucknow argue that it hurt religious sensibilities in the 1930s. So Penguin is about to publish this book in May, so we'll see how it goes, and maybe it will be a fairly controversial thing. I do think, however, the question is loaded, and we should be clear about why the question is loaded, because it's as if to say that because certain Muslim organizations cynically use the same laws that were put in place in the Constitution by the British, more or less, that it either excuses it or means that we should lessen our worry about what is happening with it when Hindus do it. On the simple question of like freedom of expression, you may even have a case to make that we have a general problem here. But on the question of violence mobilized by religious groups for cynical political gain, I don't think you've got a case to make. I think that there is a much harder time that you have in terms of calling this a generalized problem inside of India. And that's why the question of Hindutva is not simply a question of religious intolerance mobilized by various cynical actors, because we should be frank, it is, right? There are right-wing Muslim organizations that also mobilize the same kind of fear and panic about the predicament of Muslims in India for their advantage. None of them have been able to carry out the kind of carnage that the Hindu right has been able to carry out. None of them have had the same kind of political success that the Hindu right has had. None of them have had the ability to affect, policy, police efforts, et cetera, the way that the Hindu right has. I think there's a substantially different order of magnitude problem that you have when you think about what is done in the name of Hinduism by far-right Hindu organizations versus what is done by Muslim organizations. So I think it was a shame that Salman Rushdie was not allowed to come to the Bombay Literary Festival or the Jaipur Literary Festival. It's an absolute shame that has happened. At the same time, I think that I don't think that instance somehow makes this a generalized problem. I think that Hindutva is a unique cluster of ideas and a unique sort of historical development that has to be understood as a very, very different phenomenon.
Let me just say a couple things as well. We're facing a rising tide of militant, extremist, religious nationalism worldwide, and when it comes right down to cases, it doesn't even matter that much what the religion is. So in Burma, you see Buddhists of all people going crazy about Muslims, attacking them savagely. There's almost nobody, even Aung San Suu Kyi hardly speaks up for the rights of Muslims in Burma. In
Sri Lanka, same thing.
Yeah. In Thailand, again, there's violence against Muslims goes up and down, but has been increasing dramatically in the past few decades. In places that are dominated, especially by Islamist political movements, you see very often violence against Christians. You see Sunni Shia violence. You see all of these things are on a rising tide, and the idea that the best way to fight fires with fire is clearly not one that is working. So, secondly, another idea that is clearly not working is the idea that India has always had, that it's okay to censor all kinds of ideas if they bother somebody, if they offend someone. The notion is usually, well, we can't let the satanic verses be published here because there'll be riots and people will be killed. Well, guess what? There have been lots of riots and lots of people have been killed. Somebody might try instead a policy where we say everyone has the freedom to express what they like, and everybody has to sort of start practicing not being offended enough to go and burn someone's house down or kill someone. This is something I banged my head against the entire length of my activist career. It's not something unique to the situation of India and Modi. People mostly decide what they want in terms of what they support, in terms of what's comfortable for them or what they feel is convenient or is going to be helpful for them or people they're related to, and then manufacture moral and ethical justifications afterwards. And so if you try attacking, what you're attacking essentially is those epiphenomena. You're saying, well, your moral and ethical justifications don't make sense because of this and that, but those aren't the core of why they're actually deciding their allegiances, right? So there's no magic answer. It's very frustrating. It's difficult, and it's most of the time it's a losing game. It's just that the lesson of transformative politics is you always lose except for those times when you win. And you never know which one is going to be one of those times. Sometimes you have radical transformations of values. It's not going to happen in India until particularly the sort of aspiring new elite, mostly Hindu or almost all Hindu, largely urban, mostly entrepreneurial or corporate executives or people sort of in their orbit, start learning to see the rest of India. I think right now they don't see them. They don't know that they exist. There's a film that comes over their eyes when they look at anyone else, and I don't know how to get through that, but obviously at some point it's likely that somebody will.
I think that there's a bigger problem, which is that when you talk about two sides, it narrows the debate down pretty quickly. And the fact of the matter is that the BJP is wrong about many things, but they're not entirely wrong about their critique of the Congress Party. And the Congress Party is right on many things about the BJP, but they're not right on the ways that they've taken up the debate about communalism. So the questions are that you have two political forces, both of whom have enough right on their side and enough wrong on their side, that the debate is really sort of a never-ending debate for that reason. Because anytime you talk about Modi's dealings in Gujarat, you're left with Congress corruption. Anytime you talk about Congress being right on secularism, you're left with the debate about Rajiv Gandhi in 1984 and communalism against. So you don't have like a sort of clean case to make. And this has been one of the problems in Indian politics, is that there hasn't been a consistent left opposition that has any credibility anymore on this question. Anything that the Communist Party might have had was gone out the window after Nandigram and Singur and the fiascos in West Bengal. So who now is a consistent fighter for not just justice for minorities, but also an economic strategy which isn't simply give everything to the rich as fast as you can, which both the Congress and the BJP want to do, who actually has a track record that can be meaningful. And the only people right now who are able to mobilize on that kind of capital are people like Arvind Kejriwal, who is speaking to, I think, a big discontent that exists, especially amongst urban populations, on the question of clean government, but has no economic development strategy. So it's the reason why he can get elected but not run anything or do anything, and keeps doing this kind of back and forth game in Delhi. And people like Medha Patkar, who occasionally make alliances with, So these are the kinds of forces I think that you have to work with to figure out where sort of different kind of politics can come from and lie. And I think that that's really going to be the work that we have to do to figure out of how to make that happen. Because the Congress-BJP debate is a stupid debate. This is why it's not fun to engage in this fight at all, because every time you critique the BJP, you're assumed to be a congressperson, and then you can't fight the fight anyway, right? So at least this is the problem that I have when I argue with my father. I'm just extrapolating it into, I think, other conversations. I think that it's probably worthwhile to say that, the lack of a different political alternative means that everybody's able to say everybody is corrupt, and no real sort of philosophical questions or ideological questions on the problem of communalism are able to come forward. I also believe that, there's been a real kind of dismissal of confident Muslim voices in India in terms of intellectual discussion and intellectual debate. And one of the ways that this is probably going to change is with confident Muslim self-assertion organizations that are saying something very, very different about their treatment, their lives, their role in India as well. So that's all I can. I mean, it's not an answer, but it is to say that the situation that we're in is historically determined by the fact that the two big forces in the debate are both have dirty hands.
One of the other big electoral stories, aside from the rise of the BJP, has been the collapse of the left and the rise of their sort of replacement, in a sense, by caste-based parties. And that happened for very understandable reasons, but I don't think that I think that what we're seeing is sort of the Indian electoral politics hurtling fast towards an ideological dead end, where it's about constituencies and interests, but there's not very much about broader visions of justice, whether social, economic, or otherwise, except for your own, the group that you happen to represent. So that's why it's so important that in fact there needs to be something new. And I would say this, just very briefly that the Aam Aadmi Party has all the limitations you say, but simply by virtue of the fact that it's something new, it means that it hasn't been set and calcified in terms of figuring out what its constituencies are and what its ideologies are, and it's something that's potentially exciting. I mean, it's problematic too, but I'm watching its development with great interest.
So the question is, if Hinduism is the identity of India, what replaces Hinduism, and whether or not India needs to be unified by some identity or not. Okay. I think that this is a much more complicated question than can be answered in a session like this, especially given that there are legitimate national self-determination movements still raging in India, arguing for their own independence from a country which they never agreed to enter into. Kashmir is probably the most important example of this. I'm assuming, too, if you were to ask a number of the people in India's northeast whether they want to be part of, if given the opportunity to have a distinct nation, whether they would want it or not, I'm sure some of them would say that India does not. I mean, and also the violence recently about, in places like Delhi against Indians from the Northeast is another proof that it's not still one integrated country. And this was the problem that colonialism created, right? They claimed that this territorial unit represented one nation, and then Indians fabricated a national story to go along with the territorial map of what the British produced. There wasn't a kind of homogeneous or even organic or spontaneous kind of solidarity that existed amongst people, and so it had to be forged. Some of that could be done through the networks of the Congress Party in the fight against colonialism. Others of that could be done culturally through religious institutions and organizations that existed throughout the country. I think it's an open question about whether or not this is one country or 100 countries in one, right? This is, I think it's an open question that we should ask, and especially when power, wealth, and resources are distributed so unevenly, I think that it's fair to ask whether sort of the unification at all costs has basically meant some of the social problems that India is facing right now. The fight around Telangana is another sort of way of understanding this problem, right? Which has been resource distribution to a state, inside of a state, to the state from the central government, then inside of the state by the state government, based on a part of the country that fought for several years after independence not to join India, that had to be suppressed militarily by the Indian state before what now is two states were annexed into the country. I actually think it's an open question about whether or not the idea of unity and diversity that Nehru put forward, which was a fantastic way of talking about secularism, also had some real violent consequences at the heart of it. India goes to war to try to protect its territorial integrity when Kashmir decides that it maybe doesn't want to be independent, or the Northeast decides that these are two of the most militarized places inside of India. So I'm not sure that it is one nation that we should just automatically assume requires a different identity to fill the vacuum that Hinduism would leave should Hindutva be replaced. And secondly, I think we do really have to ask the question of what has India done in now 60 plus years of its independence, like for everybody inside of the country, that would warrant us to be together. Because I think that a genuine politics of solidarity requires us dealing with social justice issues and questions, and at a minimum it requires demilitarizing Kashmir and the Northeast before we can even ask a question like, does this territorial unit deserve to be a country or not? I don't think it's a simple question at all.
This question is about the role of mass movements in India and their abilities to sort of recreate local community and thus sort of lead to increased social solidarity and presumably development and political change. I can't say very much to that directly. I think that one thing, there's a prejudice that a lot of American activists have, that somehow mass movements are the only way you get things done, electoral politics doesn't matter, and that as long as, quote, the people rise up, then in fact you can accomplish whatever is needed. It's actually a much fuzzier and more unclear picture than that. And sometimes it's not clear who the people is, and it's not clear necessarily if the people know what they want. So if you look at Ukraine, you have the interesting situation that in the past 10 years, the same guy, Viktor Yanukovych, has twice been ousted from power by a popular mass movement, and in the middle, he was returned by free elections. So So it's very confusing to figure out when you have competing claims of legitimacy between mass movements and electoral politics, what the hell is really going on, what you should support procedurally, what you should support substantively. In India, I think that there's never been as much of a distinction between political parties and mass movements, and all parties rely on some sort of usually highly authoritarian mass mobilization. So it's even, I think, harder to sort of distinguish between the two. You have very often elite-driven mobilizations where you claim that something is the will of the people, but in fact it's actually carrying out the orders of a few people at the top. In general, I would say that I don't think that mass movements disconnected from electoral politics are going to be able to, in general, it's going to be hard enough for them to try to simply stem the tide of worse things coming down the pike without actually sort of being able to enact transformative change.